Nakakainis, umuulan na naman. Siguradong bahan na naman sa dadaanan ko. Umuwi na lang kaya ako tapos gawin ko yung assignment ko kay Sir Nesta.
A few minutes later.
Hola, this is Milka, and for this video, I will talk about the risk model. It is given by hazard times exposure times vulnerability. Now, for better understanding, let us define each of them. Disaster risk is the potential loss of life, injury, or destroyed assets. And according to the risk model, it is equal to hazard. It is a phenomenon or situation that has the potential to cause harm or loss. Times exposure. It refers to people and properties that may be affected by a disaster. Times vulnerability. It refers to the factors that increase the susceptibility to the impact of the hazard. Now, let us use typhoon as an example of a disaster and to further explain the risk model. Let us talk about the hazard. The disaster will be increased if the hazard or the typhoon is stronger. Just like Typhoon Yolanda way back 2013. Because it is a super typhoon and one of the most powerful tropical cyclones ever recorded, the loss of life and properties are high as expected. And it becomes higher because of the exposure. If there are more people or properties in that area, then you will expect a higher magnitude of disaster risk. Imagine a typhoon passing through an unpopulated island versus an overpopulated one. Of course, the overpopulated one will be more devastated than the other. Last, the vulnerability. During a typhoon, those low-lying areas and areas near bodies of water are more vulnerable than the others. Also, imagine a typhoon happening in a community where all houses are nipa huts against a community where all houses are made of stone. Of course, those houses that are made of nipa huts will be expected to be devastated than those community where their houses are made of stone because it is strong and sturdy. Imagine those homeless people whenever they are affected by typhoons than those who are at the comfort of their homes. Those homeless people lack information, food, and shelter which makes them vulnerable than the others. Now, let us summarize. The disaster risk will be higher if the disaster is stronger, there are more number of exposure, and there is an increase in vulnerability because risk is equal to hazard times exposure times vulnerability. And in math, to multiply means to add equal groups. When we multiply, the number of things in the group increases. That is why as the factors increase, or as the hazard, exposure, and vulnerability increase, the product also increases, or the disaster risk also increases. Now, the question is, can we reduce the disaster risk? Yes, of course. If the factors will be decreased, then the product or the disaster risk will also be decreased. I think this will be the end of my video. I hope you learned something from me. Stay safe. Bye!
Hi, good day. I'm Ina Aline Alvillamor and I will be explaining about risk model. Risk model is the risk equals to hazard times exposure times vulnerability. So what is risk? Risk is the possibility of something bad happening. Risks involve uncertainty about the effects, implications of an activity with respect to something that humans value, such as health, well-being, wealth, property, and environment, often focusing on negative, undesirable consequences. Risk is related in quarantine in Kanluran, my place. The risk is the possibility that I can be positive in COVID-19 if I'm going to leave the house. Hazard. So what is a hazard? So a hazard is a source of what can happen to you through exposure and vulnerability. Basically, a hazard is a potential for harm or an adverse effect. If Kanluran is quarantined, technically the hazard here is the virus and the other people that was positive, but mostly it is the virus. Next, exposure. Exposure. The presence of people, livelihood, ecosystem, environmental function, services and resources, cultural assets in places and settings that could be adversely affected. Exposure is the Kanluran became quarantine because the case of COVID is getting higher and it's virus for us people, animal, property that was in Kanluran that was exposed. That's why it's quarantine. And last, vulnerability. Vulnerability encompasses a variety of concepts and elements that include sensitivity. If the Kanluran is quarantined and I'm one of those people that are not allowed to go outside, technically I'm exposed in the virus. Why? Because if the whole Kanluran is quarantined, it means the virus is all over the place. And if I have a weak body, meaning I'm vulnerable to have a COVID. So that's all, sir. I hope you understand and like it. Thank you po.
Good day everyone, I'm Michelle Redulia from grade 11 STEM A, and for today, we are going to talk about disaster risk model. But first, let's define the risk model by defining the terms risk and model. Risk model refers to the possibility or chance of loss, harm, or danger, while the model refers to the systematic description of a phenomenon or abstract process. In general, risk model refers to the systematic flow or illustration of a possible harm or danger may happen in an area. Risk model may vary depending on the elements, legends, way of illustration, or factors that is included within the model itself. Our risk model, the picture you can see on the screen right now, has 4 variables, which stands for the risk, hazard, exposure, and variable. So as you can see here in the model, H stands for the hazards. Hazards means it is the possible source of danger or harm. Next is the letter E. E stands for exposure. It is referring to the people and the property damaged. Then lastly, the letter V, vulnerability. It refers to the various factors such as social, physical, economic, and environmental that increase the susceptibility to the impact of the hazard. So for now, let's use the risk model for us to determine whether the place or situation has a possible risk or not in the following examples. First off, let's go in a supermarket. There are lots and different common risks we may encounter, but let's just cite a less dangerous situation. So guys, as you can see on the screen, there is the example number 1, which is in the office or in the mall, which is the floor is wet. From the top, make it drop, that's so wet, that's so wet. And there is the yellow signboard. So for our H, the hazard, we may use the wet is floor since it is very common when we are visiting the supermarket. It is considered a hazard because it's just a wet floor and nothing can be harmed from that yet. Then for our E, exposure, the question is that who are the possible victims or will be damaged when someone get across or near the wet floor. So possibly the customers, especially elders, or even PWDs can be affected by the wet floor. And also, the staffs or crew who might carry loads can be affected. Basically, the wet floor limiting the space inside the supermarket, making the customers to feel uncomfortable inside. Also, it lacks the staffs to move freely while working. Lastly, for our V, vulnerability, the question is that what are the possible factors making the wet
From the top, make it drop, that's so wet, that's so wet.
floor more dangerous for our victims? This can be that there are no signages or warning signs,
or when there is no watchers to warn our victims to not walk near the wet floor. So, if you noticed it all, the hazard, exposure, and vulnerability, there is a risk inside the supermarket. For the last example, let's talk about when there is a typhoon. How can we say that there is a risk in a typhoon even though typhoon is considered a risk also? And now, let's go to our risk model. For our H hazard, think about what may happen when there is a typhoon. A flood. Why flood? It is because it's just a flood, since there are no victims or affected yet.
Ubus na ulan, aking mundo'y tinuring-tuluyan. Tulad ng pag-agos mo, di mapipigil ang puso kong nag-aliliya.
For our E, or the exposure, just like what I have said earlier, it is the victims or possible damage it may cause. Of course, the whole community. Their houses and their belongings may be flushed away, as well as some plants and animals they take care of and raised for a long time. Lastly, for our V, or vulnerability, it is the factors making the hazard more worst or harmful. It can be the garbages stuck in the drainage system all over the community, making the water rise higher. Also, the possibility of having leptospirosis and other diseases. Aside from that, poverty and being a irresponsible citizen can affect the recovery of the community. Therefore, having flood in typhoon is a risk that could cause a lot of damage to property and lives of the community. If a given situation or an event creates a hazards, exposures, and vulnerability, therefore we can say that it can cause a risk.